Yeah, hit me up. Wait, real quick. Can you sell me on Malcolm X?
No. Maybe a bit more than you might say.
I think so, because I started, especially on my plane ride back and forth, I started reading a lot more on, because I thought I was going to have a debate on it. I started reading a lot more on civil rights, on what happened in Albany, Montgomery, Selma, like a lot of the stuff that was going on with MLK and all this shit, the Birmingham stuff. And I'm going to be honest, I also tried to look up like stuff related to Malcolm X. Did he accomplish, this sounds really bad, but like, was he an important figure in the civil rights movement? That sounds so mean to say, I'm sorry.
Yeah, he was important, but at the end of the day,
did he get anything done?
MLK got the legislation passed.
Yeah, because I feel like Malcolm X's entire life led up to the end of him being like, you know what, maybe this actually isn't the way to go. And then I'm pretty sure like the Nation of Islam killed him, and then it was like, okay.
Yeah, so he was Nation of Islam all the way up until what, like 64, and then he them off. And I think he was still a black nationalist after that, but it kind of sounds like he was just kind of on his own journey, whilst MLK was quite consistent throughout the whole thing.
But something I didn't parrot that talking point without the proper background to say so, like a retard, that other people parrot that like, well, MLK was pretty important, but like people like Malcolm X were like what really made it work, because there was that, you know, the violence and the peace together. But it really seems like these figures were largely irrelevant when it came to like being effective for legislation. But go ahead, tell me,
So I've read a few academic papers on this, and like I still have about 4 left that I've managed to find. This idea that there was a dual strategy of violence and non-violence is not taken seriously by anyone, as far as I know, in academia.
Sure.
There was one paper I found that is trying to give more credence to the idea that, well, first of all, the only violence that actually like definitely helped the civil rights movement was the violence of police officers and sheriffs and the Klan, right?
Sure.
Like Bull Connor and shit.
Yeah.
But I think what did help, and there's even the author who says this, by the way, this is in 2016, and the author claims to be the first person to make this case, like academically, that what helped with Malcolm X and the black nationalists wasn't so much that this like a strategy of violence, but a threat of violence. So. And I think it's quite logical, because if you think about the whole MLK strategy of like, you start with negotiating, if that fails, you do the self-purification and you prepare people, and then you go with your nonviolent marches. Like there's this kind of state, like a procedure before like you actually even resort to civil disobedience. But then after that, if you do civil disobedience for like 10 years and the state still ignores you and the cops still keep attacking you, well then, maybe you probably will go to violence. Yeah. So it's more that like it's and the author who says this is kind of like admits that he's only going off of circumstantial evidence, but I think some of it is like a little bit convincing. So he goes through talks that like JFK had about like constantly talking about the threat that there's a big bitterness in the atmosphere across the whole country, that that there were riots happening, and if we don't do something there are going to be more. And even when Malcolm X was out with the Nation of Islam, he started to change his message to that as well. He would actually say in his, I think it was a speech that he gave in Selma, where like not long before he died, where he essentially said that I'm basically here to like remind the authorities of what will happen if people don't listen to MLK, right? I think when MLK was in jail, he like Malcolm X like he had this talk with
you
King's
say that
wife,
speech. I'm interested in reading it, because my understanding is I don't know if did Malcolm X respect MLK at all? Because I feel like when Malcolm X spoke about MLK, I'm pretty sure he called him a coon. Like in the speeches that I saw.
So this is like when he's out with the Nation of Islam. I think this is 65, when he's in Selma for the Voting Rights Act. And he says to a reporter, listen to Dr. Martin Luther King, give him what he's asking for, and give it to him fast before some other factions come along and try to do it another way. What he's asking for is right, so that's the ballot. King and his followers are trying to impress the people of the area. They should give the black man the right to vote. They're saying like you'd be smart to listen to King. And I think he even said to he said like the white people should thank God that Dr. King is telling people to be nonviolent, right? And I think even to Martin Luther King's wife, he said, I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. What I did was I came thinking that I could make it easier. If the white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they'll be more willing to hear him. So
I need to look up more. I don't know if that was a fact or not, but at the very least I should be aware of those speeches.
But it's interesting that he said that, because it's very similar to something that King said in the Birmingham jail letter. There's that bit in the Birmingham jail letter when oh, by the way, the next time someone uses the white moderate thing
yeah,
to justify some dumb shit, I'm so ready to just make whoever tries to do that to me again themselves, because it's used so dishonestly. There's a whole bit in it where he says that he himself, MLK, feels like, very estranged between complacency of like the black middle classes, but also the hatred and violence of the black nationalists. So you think about, like, if he said a lot of what he was saying in that letter today, people would probably
call him a white moderate. They would say,
they call him a white moderate.
Let me read you this letter from a Birmingham prison about the white moderate, because that's what you are right now, fam.
Yeah. But there is a bit in there where he does kind of give the same warning as Malcolm X, where he did say that that he's like constantly afraid that if the demands of the civil rights movement aren't met, then he's going to lose supporters to the likes of the Nation of Islam. That he can only keep up nonviolence for so long. Yeah, that's like I can't remember. I'm trying to find the exact thing because my notes are already like 30 pages long. But I'm further convinced that that if the nonviolent efforts don't get support, then millions of black people will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies. And then that would lead to what he called a frightening racial nightmare. So, like, at no point is MLK ever saying that this violence is going to be like a good thing. It's just that it might be inevitable if the demands of the civil rights movement aren't met, But as far as I know, there's nothing saying that violence was like a good tactic. It's just the threat of violence might have inspired people like JFK or Lyndon Johnson to push things faster. Do you have does that sell you more in Malcolm X than you were before this?
No, not really, but that's okay. It's not really so. I shouldn't shout out Malcolm X. That's me. Andy's from my hometown, so shout out to that on Hood. I think that the just the issue that I had was that there is like this weird this is like some cringe shit that I'm noticing, okay? I feel like I learned something in high school, and then I feel like I get a little bit older, and then like I'm starting to learn on social media shit that everything I learned in high school was wrong. And then when I dig in and I do more research, I learn that actually it was pretty correct. I think that like I remember when I read about like civil rights, and the little bit I remember from high school, it's like civil rights was all about nonviolence and like no matter what you do, hold arms and don't ever attack the police and blah blah blah. And then I get older and it was like actually it was the really violent the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and all these things. That's what actually frightened people. And I was like, okay. And then when I do, now that I've done a bit more reading and very scant, I haven't researched, this is like 3 hours of reading, right? So I haven't like dug into this a ton by any stretch of the imagination. But now as I dig into it more, it seems like this is something that came up in an argument that I had with Pisco too, and I didn't have the language for this yet over the Anna Kasparian tweet, that not the principle of nonviolence is way different than not being violent. That those two things are like, they're a completely different thing. And that the tactics that were employed by both sides of civil rights seemed to revolve around that concept of nonviolence and how important it was to show videos of your ass getting beat by the other side without you doing anything wrong. That was before I think before Birmingham, there was Martin Luther King's movement was losing steam because they had just failed pretty fantastically in I think it was the Albany movement. And as I was reading through this, one of the reasons why they think that movement failed was because the police on the opposite side of that movement had become familiar with Martin Luther King's tactics, and they explicitly avoided at all costs having violent confrontations with protesters. So they expanded the prisons, they started moving people around to different jails in the county, they did everything they could to lock up protesters peacefully. But once they got to Birmingham, you mentioned Connor the Bull, whatever the fuck that guy's last name was. That dude was ruthless. And not only was he ruthless, people that were MLK's allies, because they were having a hard time getting citizens to be like ideologically united, they did the incredibly controversial tactic that MLK I don't even think was on board with initially, of going into schools and training high schoolers and shit to like, you guys are gonna march, you're gonna get your ass beat, you're gonna get eaten up by dogs, and that's what's gonna like make this work. And that's essentially what they did. But that there was like this weird like psychological warfare on both sides of like, all I need to do, I just have to get pictures and videos of you being mean to my people without us actually being mean to you, and then we win. And like, that's it. That was like the goal. And I didn't realize that like, the nonviolence principle stuff was like that hyper focused on like that. It really is that specific of like, we're going to be nonviolent. We're going to show us like just standing here, literally the kumbaya shit. And we want you to beat the shit out of us. And then we're going to go like, we're going to get clips viral on TikTok worldwide. And we're going to get the Civil Rights Act passed. Like that was like, it seemed literally that was, the strategy.
Yeah, they called it self-purification. They would spend like weeks and months preparing young people to get like to just constantly remind themselves like, can I take a hit from the police without hitting back? Then like gathering all the knives and shit like that. But the fact that they called it self-purification is like to not hit back to cops. Again, it's like people would just call that tone policing or whatever the fuck. I think even like JFK made a joke to this to one of the civil rights leaders, which is that like he was basically saying like you shouldn't really be that harsh on the Bull Connor because he's probably done like more for civil rights than almost everyone else.
Yes, I remember reading that exact quote actually. It was a very edgy quote, but that the civil rights movement might owe a lot to the Bull Connor. Because he literally everything up hardcore because they were using fire hoses on like school children. They were sicking German shepherds on school children, and those clips went viral worldwide. Like everybody around the world saw how fucking horrible that was. And
it was the same thing with Sheriff Clark for the Voting Rights Act, right? Like he had like Klanmen helping him, and everyone saw that for what it was. So the fact that it's just like clip farming, right?
It's irritating now because like so many lefties online are like they're trying to whitewash the Civil Rights Act. In reality, it was like brave Antifa warriors that did it. It was all the violence, and it's like not only do we know today empirically with BLM that didn't work, and like we all saw it in real time, right? Like George Floyd galvanized the nation because you just saw like a black dude getting like killed by a cop for it didn't seem like a good reason. And same thing with BLM when you saw people getting attacked. But on the flip side, right? Look at like Kenosha, for instance. I think you can make an argument that both sides of Kenosha were mobilized by the same type of violent on nonviolent action, right? You had the initial reporting of Jacob Blake getting shot in the back, which was horrible. And then I had at least one person, I think one person from Kenosha emailed me, I should fact check this, but he said that one of the biggest reasons why the Facebook groups were posting ads trying to recruit people to go and help defend Kenosha was because of the viral video of that one. There was like a store owner outside one of the stores in Kenosha, I think who was getting beaten up with a fire extinguisher. Do you remember this at all?
The person who was trying to put out a fire, wasn't
I think
it?
so, yeah. And then I think he got his ass beat by protesters. And he said that video is what encouraged so many people to move into Kenosha to do like the counter protesting or whatever. It seems like it's a similar thing on both sides that generally when you look at how much sympathy, like an impossibility is sympathy from people on the left for police officers was watching the police officers getting their ass whipped on January 6th. That's probably the only time in U.S. history, that you had people on the left who had like massive amounts of sympathy for police officers.
I think my partner at the time, who is a massive like ACAB anarchist, was like watching that video of the cop like PTSD crying and shit, like saying it was like stop making me sympathize with cops while we were watching that.
I think it's
really
just funny. It's impossible, and it's funny not to I am a natural MLK, but like it's funny when I compare it to like my debate strategies. Is one of the things that I talk about a lot that I kind of figured out is that like if you're going to go really hard on somebody, you have to earn it first. Like they have to do the first shot. But if you ever start laying into people, even if they're a little bit mean, you have to earn that and you have to earn it by them acting shitty first. But if you go first, even if they kind of deserve it, it doesn't matter. You always look bad. And it seems like for a lot of the principles of nonviolence or protesting and everything, it's the exact same principle.
Yeah, and I think I just wonder, like, the problem is if there was never the threat of there being any violence, because that's the kind of thing I'm trying to humor, I guess, is that if legislators like JFK and Lyndon Johnson or whoever just knew that it would only ever be nonviolence, like if people like MLK would just go get the shit beaten out of them by cops and then just try again and try again and try again for like decades, and that would never lead to anything else, like, would that have like motivated them to push legislation still, or do you think that? Or for example, like when one of the senators who was trying to push the civil rights bill through was saying things like that there's like that they were worried about the rioting is going to like set off a bunch of like small Algerias in the country, and Algeria just means like a fuckload of violence, basically. Yeah.
I think that I feel like I feel like you appeal to people's humanity. Like you said, it's really, really, really hard to watch somebody like getting killed or getting beat or getting attacked by the cops if they're not doing anything wrong. I think it requires an inhuman level of psychopathy to watch that and not feel any sort of like desire to act or change when you see stuff like that. And I feel like that's played out several times in our country, and I think we all kind of, yeah.
Do you think, so I'd imagine obviously for achieving political goals, do you think there's ever situations where, well, there must be, right, to use violence?
I mean, if that's all you have left, I mean, like we can argue that, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are times, like the Civil War was probably necessary, right? The Revolutionary War was probably necessary, right?
It's usually the case that, like, because I think maybe some counterexamples would be like South Africa, right? Like Mandela was, like people accused him of being a terrorist, but like, the ANC did literally just like blow up power lines and shit like that, and they did actually kill a lot of civilians as well, which they later apologized for. But I don't think they ever ruled out violence until like even whilst the apartheid negotiations were still going on. Like Mandela never fully ruled out violence until it was over. So, but I think the argument there is that you're in such a different situation when it comes to like how much recourse you have otherwise, because apartheid South Africa had like a lot less room for peaceful protest than somewhere like America did.
I wonder if in the United States, it was important too that like you had like the North, that you saw that there were black people that lived like much different lives in the North than they lived in the South, and that seeing that like, well, it does work in some places. It doesn't have to be like the most horrible Jim Crow laws, the most shit everywhere, like, and it seems to work well. I wonder if that helps.
Probably, but also even outside of the country as well, where you've got people like Castro saying, look at America, where they still have like, because I think Castro and his propaganda used that a lot. Like he used the lack of civil rights and the violence against civil rights protesters in his speeches a lot to make people anti-America. And especially since at that time, America is trying to win allies across Africa and the Middle East away from the Soviet Union, and these are countries that have a lot of black people in them. So it doesn't look very good if you're still having like that situation where people can't even vote in the South. Yeah,
I don't know.
But that's also, that kind of goes to again towards just like other motivations, like trying to win hearts and minds around the world rather than violence.
Yeah, and it's hard to measure like how much of what is actually having an impact, right? Like it's hard to say for sure,
Yeah, so I don't really, I really find it quite difficult to see I need to look more into Malcolm X and what he was doing throughout that time, but it just seems to be that he was very popular for kind of illustrating the bitterness of black Americans at the time.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, he wasn't there at the end with the pen, like signing legislation and shit. Yeah.
Sure.
But I'm probably going to read a bit more of it, and maybe I'm trying to think of a provocative, like, way to push a video like this. Like, that if MLK were alive today, like Twitter leftists would be calling him a cuck. But that's true of a lot of leaders. It's true of like Mandela as well, completely.
Sure. You could name it like MLK and the Importance of the White Moderate or something.
True.
For the people that vote, if you really want to be edgy, yeah.
It's just the fact that like the white moderate he's talking about is people who were upset that he had like broken segregation laws and protested without a permit. It's like, how many fucking liberals are going to say that you should, or even centrists are going to say that you could never protest
I think that's an issue. Yeah, like the white moderate that he's speaking about, where white moderates who are like, like it's a little bit kind of irritating to try to push for like desegregation and stuff. So like, let's just stay segregated, and like maybe in 100 years we can revisit this topic. Like the white moderates would have like been considerably off of where we would consider civil rights to be today. But
they were. Yeah, they would, in this day and age, they would have just taken the position of right wingers, because I don't even know if like.
Do you think that Trump is used
liberals
as a threat
oppose
by
the
people
idea
like
of
Biden or Bernie as a way to pass bipartisan
because it's like the idea of like a just law and an unjust
goals.
law, right? Like I feel like that most people are behind that in one way or another. Like people who take drugs and shit. I don't know.